All right, Argent, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. I continually go through this cycle with many recurring guests where I mentally just had you on, and then I look at how long it's actually been, and I was like, oh wait, how did I let that happen? So I'm really glad to have you back on, man. I enjoyed talking to you before, and I'm excited to do so again.
Great. Thanks.
Before we launch into it, where can people find you and find your work?
People can find me on YouTube. My channel is Argent, obviously, and on Twitter as Enduring Argent, because that was the most recent account that got unbanned when Elon came back.
Yeah, it's been kind of it has shaken things up, right, in our corners that, within reason, you can kind of say whatever you want. And obviously, people have been banned, but the rate is much, much slower. And, as someone who came on the internet in the era where everyone was respawning all the time, it's sort of curious to be, to have everything be steady, at least for a little bit.
Yeah, it is weird. And uh, I got to give it, like, Elon has a lot of problems. He's far from a perfect person, but he has done our side a lot of good, if only because he lets us use Twitter relatively freely. Like, all the stuff that's going on in the UK, we wouldn't know anything about that without Twitter, because it kind of allows a way to get past the just total info embargo we have.
That's actually a valid point, and I think that especially, and I haven't really talked about what happened in the UK in extreme detail. I did have sort of an impromptu AMA stream about a week ago, and people were asking me about it. And I think that my take has aged exceptionally well, which was basically, do not get involved in this, even on an ancillary level. You will be Jan 6th. You will be railroaded through the courts. And I mean, we're seeing that now, right? This isn't why I brought you on to talk about UK riots, but I mean the fact that 1 year, 3 year, 5 year sentences are being handed out. I mean, what, it's been less than a week since then, is nothing short of amazing.
Yeah, no, I just because if you remember, I think it was the last election where the media actively suppressed the Twitter actively suppress the Hunter Biden laptop thing. Like, I think they banned the New York Post, and they just censored a whole bunch of stuff. So at least, even if the UK riot thing just kind of peters out, I think there's been a lot of good done just with the all the two-tier policing memes and the showing the videos and stuff. I just think it gives a large platform where people can actually share information that's not just 100% censored like the mainstream media is.
No, I completely agree. And again, I think there's a drive for purity on our side of things that is not always particularly helpful. And recently, obviously, the old CEO of YouTube, her passing was announced,
Mm-hmm.
which for official reasons I'm very, very sad about.
Deeply
But
sad.
nonetheless, right, I think it's notable to compare and contrast the two platforms, right? Musk isn't one of us, but I mean, you can say all number of very spicy things about historical 20th century, occurrences,
Mm-hmm.
and you won't be bothered. You can say all your gamer words, and I mean, as long as you don't really tick off someone big, you're basically fine.
He
And
retweets a lot of like good, like edgy memes and like pretty good people and stuff. Like, he goes a lot further. Like, once again, he's not exactly our guy, but it's a vast improvement over basically whatever was there before.
well, and that's exactly my point, right? Is it's like, well, is it like if you gave me a laboratory where I could, craft the ideal, you know, tech billionaire, would it be Elon Musk? No. But I mean, look at every other social media CEO or social media owner and compare and contrast from there.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, there are several things that I wanted to talk to you about. I've been talking with my friend Black Horse, who's another Leaf, for a long time now about the Canadian housing crisis,
Uh-huh.
and you did a video on it that I thought was quite amusing. Your videos are always They make me laugh. And you were covering sort of a new development in that story. So do you want to kind of introduce, what you made that video about?
Okay, sure. So, to the best of my understanding, just for reference, how long is there a maximum mortgage length in the U.S.? Like a maximum amount of time you can have one for?
Let me look that up. I
I
actually
think
don't know
it's
the
30
answer.
years.
I think that's
It's
correct.
30 or 35 years. So in Canada, it was previously the maximum amount of time you could have a mortgage for was 25. So because the housing crisis is such a disaster, Justo's plan was we're gonna extend it to 30-year mortgages.
Okay.
And it's like
Okay,
it's gonna
Argent. There is there is a maximum term for a mortgage in the US.
what is it, like 50 years?
50 years.
Okay, it's 50 years.
Sorry, that's pretty stupid.
In practice, I doubt that many people. I think 25 to 30 is the standard in most cases. So yeah, he decided to just extend the amount of mortgage. And the point I was trying to make is, well, access to credit and financing can be the limiting factor in a lot of places. If you're having, and I can't recall off the top of my head, if housing prices are going up like 8 to 10% a year, financing isn't really the issue.
Right.
Like it's maybe like it doesn't change the fact that it's an increasingly high percentage of your income. Like if housing prices were kind of steady relative to your income, and then you were introducing some of these things that made it easier for people to borrow money or easier to finance things, then that might make sense. But it's a good kind of comparison to this. I did some of this when I was in university. Is the agricultural sector is very much like this. So it's very heavily subsidized. So what agricultural companies will often do is they will raise their prices to the point where farmers can't afford them. And then farmers will lobby the government and then they'll give them more subsidies. So then they'll be able to afford it and then they'll just raise the prices. And it's just kind of a cycle. So it's a bit like that. I think university also kind of works like that in the US, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's very much what happens, right? There's sort of this stair step, where first the cost goes up, then the subsidy goes up.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, it's interesting, right? Because if we look at, and I went to school for finance, so I know a little bit about mortgages. Not that that information is proved in any way useful, but effectively, what you're doing with a mortgage is that, generally speaking, the longer the term, not even generally speaking, it's just how math works, right? The longer the term, the more you pay in interest, right?
Yeah.
And with each sequential payment, more of that payment goes towards the actual principal, right? The balance of the
Mhm.
loan, and less goes to the actual interest. So if you're ever wondering why
Or do you
lending
mean the
companies,
reverse?
oh yeah, sorry, I said that wrong, right? As time goes on, more and more of your payment goes towards the actual value of the loan, and less goes to interest. Excuse me.
Mhm.
Now, if you ever wondered, right, why lending companies are always asking you to refinance, it's so they can slide you back to the end of that scale, right, to get more
Mhm.
more payment from you, or get more payment of interest. Now, in this case, right, where you have a runaway housing costs, and you went into the video. In many cases it was up 50%, in some locales much
It
more than
depends
that.
very heavily on what part of the country it is. Like in Alberta, it's been basically flat, but in a lot of the country, even in like the relatively poor parts of the country, it's gone up like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% over the last 4 years or so. It's gone up. I guess we can at least just say it's gone up far faster than wages have.
Well, and that runs into another kind of quirk of Canada, which is, as far as I understand, right, that it's heavily concentrated from a population standpoint. Most people live in a very narrow geographic
I think
area,
about
kind of close
100
to the U.S.
kilometers
borders.
from the border or so is where I think 80 to 90% of the population lives. Like in the province I live in, 1% of the population lives in the top 60% of it. Um, because it's just kind of the way it is. There's a lot of reasons you can't build on permafrost. Infrastructure can be kind of difficult. Well, there's a lot of fertile land in Canada. Once again, a lot of it is just kind of remote. Also, in kind of central Canada, like Ontario, Manitoba, it's just a mass. We have the Canada Shield, so it's just sheer rock, and there's not a lot you can really do with it. So it's just not really practical. There is a meme somebody posted the other day about how Canada needs to take in more immigration because it has here, I'll just send that to you. But because it has so much space, but very little of the country is actually usable.
Well, and obviously, right, the reason this story matters is because it is a absolutely woeful response to a very real problem uh, that most Canadians are facing, right? Which is absolutely runaway cost of living. And the idea that, oh, we'll just increase the term of your loan. So over the course of your life, you end up actually paying more. It's just like
Well,
the kind of most pathetic shell game.
and I mean, there's a couple different things. So I'm not sure. What's your retirement savings things called in the US? 401ks?
Yeah, 401ks, that
Yeah,
tax
so it's
shelter.
it's the RRSP, the Registered Retirement Saving Plan. So previously you could borrow 40 grand from it and without having to pay tax because you get a tax credit for putting money in your 401k in the
So
US.
basically, the way it works in the US is that you're allowed to put the money into the account pre-tax. So,
Okay,
for
yeah.
instance, it comes off your income.
Yep, same. Okay, same thing here with our RSP. So you were allowed to borrow $40,000 from your RSP for your first home purchase, which is nice because then you have to pay the money back, but you're not paying interest on it. So they doubled that, so you can now take out $80,000 and owe yourself an additional 40,000. And then they introduced this like other saving vehicle, which you can also put money in and then borrow money from yourself tax and interest free. And like once again, I get that would probably be helpful under other circumstances, but it's just kind of what would the expression be? Robbing Peter to pay Paul. Like if the house goes up by $40,000, and you're able to borrow another $40,000, like it doesn't make it more affordable. It makes it so that you can finance it, but you still have to pay that back. You still have to pay back the whatever the mortgages you're borrowing. It's a little hard to explain, but hopefully I'm making sense.
No, I think that you explained it well. I, the There are several interesting trends. Again, look, I've spent very limited time in Canada, so this is all anecdotal evidence, right?
Mhm.
People I have met on the internet, but there are sort of two forces at once, right? Which is it, Canada has, at least in kind of recent memory, kind of cast itself as you know the perfect liberal version of America,
Yeah.
but that hasn't really cost them very much in real terms. And then all of a sudden, you guys have been hit by mass migration very, very quickly compared to other countries. And so, obviously, importing a large number of people no doubt affects the housing market. But is there any sign at all from the elites in Canada that maybe they want to kind of pull back on how many people they're importing just to prevent housing from getting out of hand?
Uh no, but just to take one step back, just for the audience. So when it comes to housing, it's a very basic, just supply demand curve. If you have a whole bunch of immigrants coming in at a very high rate, demand increases exponentially, whereas supply increases linearly. Like it's also just because of zoning laws and regulations and stuff. It's hard to build housing in Canada. So the situation, because of immigration, just demand continually goes up. At one point, Justo said that if we bring in more immigrants, that'll help us reduce housing prices because they will have more labor to build houses. That's also just not how it works because you also need to have transportation, roads, stuff like that. Canada has a very bad public transit system. It's a bit like the US, where a substantial portion of the population would rather like drive 2 blocks than walk, or take a bus or something like that. But it's funny because if you go to Canadian Reddit, the people on Canadian Reddit are complaining about immigration.
Yeah, which is, I mean, those are, you have Canadians first and then Redditor second, and that's kind of two, fairly left-wing populations, right?
Yeah, and they'll be like, it's really depressing. They'll be like, I'm never going to be able to afford a house. There's too much immigration. I don't see any indication from the ruling class that they're willing to reduce it. It's kind of a third rail in Canadian politics that you can just never reduce immigration. It just has to keep increasing. I think Justo has even admitted, though, that he went a bit far, but it's not going to slow down. It's I think it's hard, even like in my lifetime. So like there's places where I used to live in Southern Ontario where it went from being like 90% white to 30% white in like a 20-year period. It is like how high the rate of immigration is. And it's dramatically increased recently, mostly from India. The interesting thing is it's mostly males, so a lot of them will probably eventually leave. But in the meantime, it's just a massive upward pressure on housing prices. But no, I don't think, even though there's even among like liberals, like left-wing people, there's a desire to reduce immigration. But I just don't think that whoever gets in power will do that.
All right. So I think that kind of concludes, the Canada question, at least for now. I hate to say it, Argent, but I find talking about your country incredibly depressing.
Why do you think I almost never talk about it? It's just sad. I mean, I will say this. I'm probably going to do something I didn't think I was going to do, and I'm probably just going to vote conservative next election. Because Poilievre, even if he's really cringy, has said, we'll bring back mandatory minimums for criminals and we'll repeal the hate speech legislation. So I'm like, you know what? That's enough for me to vote for him. As I was saying this about the US, we've reached the point where like someone believing that criminals should be in jail is like actually something you should be voting based on. Because like in a lot of cases, just the left doesn't even want like people in jail anymore. And if you live in a high crime area, then yeah.
Well, I mean, it is it is sort of astounding, right? When you are, like you said, deciding your vote off of the like really core basic building blocks of a civilization. Like I assume if the left continues this, that they're going to just become, they're going to take the they're going to take the Khmer Rouge pill and just decide that that literacy is a symbol of oppression.
I mean, I try to like, it's so absurd. I kind of feel silly to say it, but it is at this point. Like, there's cases where you're like, well, the one side wants to put criminals in jail and the other side doesn't. So I'm just going to have to vote based on that.
Yeah, I think we're sort of in a similar situation in the U.S. with with crime and punishment. Yeah, there was recently a news segment, and they were visiting one of these kind of blighted neighborhoods in San Francisco where just everything gets stolen all the time because the Californian state government had a absolutely genius idea where as long as you didn't steal at least $1,000 of stuff within one 24-hour period, they just wouldn't prosecute you.
Well, we have that where I live too. Like, so the big problem here is supermarkets being robbed. So there's like this, apparently there's this big underground trade in meat because meat prices are so high. So they'll go in and steal like filet mignon and New York strip or something. And then like have these black markets in like parking lots and stuff. And the police don't really bother because it's like under $1,000. But it's a very basic. I mean, there is something to the whole broken window thing where if you tolerate like minor stuff, you create a culture in which people just feel they can do anything because you see people just breaking the law, and that
Well,
kind of just leads to other stuff.
well, exactly. We're in many areas of the country, we're sort of speed running a easily preventable decline. But I want to, just land this because it's an amusing punchline, right? And they're, these news reporters are investigating, filming a segment at one of the stores that's, continually robbed in one of these Walgreens, right, which is sort of a hybrid, drugstore, convenience store, whatever.
We have a
It
lot of
was
those in Canada.
it was robbed 3 times in the 45 minutes they were reporting on the segment. Like they had cameras up, and it was robbed 3 times. And so again, right, I don't want to get off on the kind of like conservative hobby horse of, those gosh dang Democrats sure are crazy, but they sure are crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So I also wanted to speak with you about Ukraine.
Sure.
Because I will admit, I outsource a lot of my Ukraine knowledge to you in particular, and then others as well. So at the kind of the last time I paid attention to the war, things were not going well for Zelensky. He had been kind of pushed out of the limelight by my favorite Middle Eastern democracy, and things were not happening quickly, but Ukraine was kind of slowly and steadily losing ground. So what is the current kind of situation on the ground, and where are things happening?
Okay, so basically, and by the way, just for people who haven't seen my channel, I call it the Ukraine Cinematic Universe, or the UCU, just because, like last year when we had the big offensive, they released multiple movie trailers for it, and just the media kind of reports it like it's some sort of like comic book film. But okay, so basically, Reuters did a very interesting article a couple weeks back that explained that I think the US doesn't produce TNT anymore, or they're trying to restart TNT production. But most Western countries are dependent upon TNT from one aging plant in Poland. And there's just very little. Also, there's a massive shortage of gunpowder and just other basic precursors. The point
Well,
is
I
that,
can actually speak to this
oh,
as
sure,
a
go ahead.
as a anyone who shoots or reloads in the US will be aware of this. Actually, the even for small arms, right? There's kind of several components to a cartridge, right? There's the primer, which
Mhm.
the hammer hits and that sparks and sets off the chain reaction, and the industrial process to make those is incredibly difficult. Not in a technological sense, right? We should be able to do it, but it's one of those many pieces of technology that, due to environmental regulations and shipping
Mhm.
all our machines everywhere, it's very difficult to just start one of those. Like almost impossible. I think there are 2 plants in the U.S. A third is hopefully coming. So you have that, but also just the core components of it. Uh, a lot of the chemicals that are used to make explosives, uh, due to environmental regulations, are almost impossible to source in the
I
US
think
anymore.
I think the US was trying to switch to their own version of high explosive, but it just never got going.
Yes.
But most Western countries over the since the 1980s have shut down their TNT and gunpowder and other stuff. Partially because of environmental regulations, partially because it wasn't profitable enough. But how this relates to Ukraine is that there is an upper limit. There's a ceiling to the amount of weaponry that can be produced in Western countries, particularly when it comes to things like artillery shells, because artillery shells require TNT or high explosive and gunpowder. So if you're only producing a certain amount of both of those, then it just caps out. And I think the issue is because Russia and China and Iran and stuff have their own ability to make those things, they will always, at least for the foreseeable future, be able to produce far more. They're like their upper limit on production is much higher. I'm not sure if it's I think 4 or 5 times as many shells per month as that Russia's producing, and that gap keeps growing. And this is all assuming that the one TNT plant keeps going at the same rate. But the basic point is, it's not the situation Ukraine's in is not a money problem. The U.S., because they talked about the 61 billion and stuff like that. It doesn't matter if the U.S. assigned like $10 trillion or something. It's just the production capacity to build the number of weapons needed to have Ukraine stand a chance against Russia just isn't there. Like, if you look at the reports from various kind of like Ukrainian commanders, they'll say Russia's firing like 5 to 10 times as many shells a day. And I think what the U.S. thought was, we're only going to be fighting the Taliban in Iraq, and we're going to be fighting all these loser countries. We don't really need any kind of scale. Like, I think only 500 Patriot missiles are made a year, and that can't really be expanded very much. And Russia fires. Sorry, go on.
So, and this is a leading question, but why does that disparity in artillery shells matter? Right? Why is that of material concern?
Okay, sorry if I was getting. I was trying to give a bit of background to like why the situation is the way it is, because this is a conventional war. This is not a like guerrilla action. This is not just there's a bunch of guys on goats out in the mountains. This is, you have 2 large armies, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people. You have tanks, you have infantry fighting vehicles, you have artillery. Something like 10,000 shells or 4 to 10,000 shells or so will be fired every day. On a normal basis. During offensives, it goes up way higher. There's a lot of just trench warfare and stuff like that. And so in that kind of environment where we have attritional warfare, the firepower is just very important. It's like you might have having a couple fancy ultra accurate weapons are nice. Like maybe they take out a couple Russian planes or a couple Russian tanks or something, but there's just the scope of what Russia's able to produce and able to bring to bear, it's just not nearly enough. Like Russia will fire, I don't know, like 1,000 glide bombs a month. The US makes maybe 500 interceptor missiles a year. You need at least 2 or 3 per bomb. It's not enough to really keep the lights on, as it were.
Right. And so how is that difference shaping the course of the war currently?
Basically, so my narrative is that we had the big spring offensive last year, and I think America basically surged Ukraine most of its reserves of shells, of missiles, of tanks, of stuff like that. And they kind of blew through all that with basically no result. And now it's just kind of the point where Ukraine's not really able, and we'll get into the Kursk offensive, but to launch big aero offensives. They've just lost at the moment, they've just mostly been reduced to holding fortified positions and gradually retreating. And Russia's casualties are pretty steadily decreasing. Actually, it's interesting because Media Zona, which was tracking Russian casualties, recently switched their methodology because they said Russian casualties were too low. So they were tracking it by only going off of confirmed deaths, like through obituaries and Facebook posts and stuff like that. So Russian casualties have been going down. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons to defend itself. Like, for instance, Ukraine doesn't have an air force. They don't have air defense missiles. So Russia just has absolute air superiority, and their jets can just go overhead and just basically fire at will, which is not a situation you really want to be in, and that sort of thing. So what's recently happened over the last 6 months or so is we've just had a series of very brutal battles in like Avdiivka, I think was the main one. They're in Chasiv Yar at the moment, but they're just these fortified cities the Ukrainians have dug into, and the Russians will attack and they'll eventually win. But urban combat is just a very slow, brutal process. And the Zelensky government tends to just throw men into the meat grinder rather than retreat. So a lot of these become just very protracted battles that just result largely in heavy casualties.
All right. So obviously, I think that the prognosis hasn't changed. It seems like Ukraine will not win this war. And obviously, I realize that it's difficult to be in the business of making predictions, but how much longer do you think this goes on for?
Okay, so just step back. So how are we defining winning the war? Getting all of their territory back or surviving?
Actually, that's a very important uh, digression, right? Because I, I I am correct in saying that Putin has sort of changed his stance on, what he will consider uh, terms for peace. Is that correct?
It's okay. So at the beginning of the war, the terms were Crimea and Ukraine makes an agreement to never join NATO, and a couple other things like disarming Azov and some stuff like that. But it was only, I think Crimea was the only for certain territorial concessions. Now it's Crimea, the four regions, and then an agreement to never join NATO, disarming the ultra nationalist brigades and stuff like that. It does seem though Putin has hinted. I think yesterday, it was yesterday or today, that that's no longer on the table because of the whole Kursk operation. That really pissed him off. So they might not even accept any. They might have just withdrawn their last round of terms.
All right. So specifically, right, you asked me that question, what constitutes a win?
Mhm.
If I'm obviously, at the first, actually, I guess it was until very, very recently, right? There was a lot of bellicose rhetoric about, we'll take everything back, we'll get all our territory back. But I'm correct that Zelensky has sort of softened. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's all very back and forth. So the thing, once they discovered they were starting to lose, the narrative is we're going to freeze the conflict. It's going to be like Korea. So the territory Russia currently controls is going to remain occupied, but internationally recognized as part of Ukraine. And so they want to kind of come to a ceasefire. And Zelensky has said, okay, we'll come to a ceasefire. We'll freeze the conflict so we can get it back later. But the problem is, even if Russia was willing to accept that, which they aren't, because they consider the four regions to be integral parts of Russia, they will never allow Ukraine to join NATO. And Ukraine has said they will never give up trying to join NATO. So that is kind of the unresolvable question in all of this, is that Ukraine, part of Ukraine's plan is they want to freeze the conflict, join NATO, and then trigger Article 5 or whatever it is if the war starts up again. And Russia has just said that is their primary war goal, is Ukraine will never join NATO.
Do you think that the Israel Hamas war has shifted the focus of the US empire away from this conflict in a meaningful way?
I think so. I think part of it is just realistically, I'm not really sure what else they can do. I know I went into it probably a bit too much earlier, but the point is, even if the US wanted to go all in on this, unless they were willing to deplete their reserves to the point where they couldn't fight a war or directly intervene, I'm not really sure what else they could really do in the case of Ukraine.
Right. They've sort of played every card they have. And I mean, I will say, I don't want to put anything past these sort of bloodthirsty lunatics, but it doesn't seem like they're angling for a hot war with Russia.
No, I mean, they go back and forth. But it's like it's interesting because a bunch of European countries are cutting their aid to Ukraine, not because they don't want to, they just don't have the stuff. Once again, it was this level of intensity, like World War One or World War II level we haven't seen. Like I said, the US was expecting and Europe were expecting to fight like conflicts like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or something. Also, it's an article that's behind a paywall, but it was entitled "High Tech Western Weapons Work Until They Don't," and it was like, oh, Russia has electronic warfare and jamming and stuff like that. But no, as to that, I think you are correct. I think I recall when the thing in Israel started, they started diverting some of the weapons from Ukraine. Because keep in mind, when we talk about like production figures or something, that's for everybody, that's for the world. So it's not as if Ukraine's going to get everything. And if Israel is blowing through Iron Dome interceptors and Patriot missiles and artillery shells and stuff like that, that increasingly has to be shared with Israel. And because it's Israel, it means that they're going to always get first pick of everything.
Yes, they are our specialist special ally.
Well, I mean, America won the war in Vietnam because Israel intervened on your behalf.
I think I should stop talking about this topic for the sake of my YouTube channel.
Okay, okay, but
no, I'm mostly joking, but I'm also not that much joking because I have opinions. I'll put it that way.
Okay, I will say this though, the broader problem, and this is the thing that really scares me. So let's say that you're I forget what the current president of Iran's name is. Let's say you're Putin or Xi or Kim or Khamenei or the head of or Assad or something, and there's some sort of crisis going on. Israel's doing something, people are shooting at each other, there's some kind of misunderstanding. We're heading to World War III. Who do you call in the US other than Ghostbusters?
I don't know. Tell me where you're gonna land this.
Well, I mean, do you call Biden? Do you call Blinken? Do you call Kamala? Like, who's in charge in the US?
Oh, I see where you're going here. I mean, that's a valid point, right? And zooming out a little bit, if we go back to the ancient year 2020, you would constantly hear the refrain, "The adults are back in the room," right?
Yeah.
And buried within that is the idea that, oh, we're going back to normal, where smart people with degrees from prestigious universities are at the helm. And one, that became kind of a laughable refrain relatively quickly, because all politics aside, and I don't say this out of any kind of like moral indignation or I'm not trying to be bombastic, but Biden was a very, very bad president. Like, he did a lot of things that genuinely hurt America as a nation and then also as an empire. And the interesting development, right, of the last few weeks has been the disappearance of Biden, right? Biden is gone, to the point where there's been significant speculation that this is a Weekend at Bernie's situation where he has died or is brain dead.
As I said, when you reach the point where there's serious questions as to whether or not the president is a deep fake or an AI, you've kind of already lost at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the major problems Kamala poses to the regime is that, okay, let's assume that there is a surplus of ethics and video game journalism, that we have an even freer and fairer election than we had last time, and due to the Vox Populi, Kamala is installed. Well, okay, you can do that, but we already have a legitimacy crisis, both domestically, right? We have a large percentage of the population that thinks that the 2020 election had an insufficient amount of freeness and fairness.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking around this not because I'm afraid to say it, but because YouTube is a little bit funky about this stuff. Well, okay, you have that problem domestically, right? You have a large number of people, roughly 35%, who believe the government is illegitimate domestically. That's a big problem, especially if you're looking to get involved in a war, and those populations are the exact kind that are actually involved in combat arms.
Yeah.
And then on the geopolitical stage, like you were alluding to, well, if you are a U.S. ally, who do you call? Like, do you call Blinken? Do you call Lloyd Austin? Right? To any of these people?
I'm being facetious, but not. But like it's an honest question. Like we're having so many like cases of brakemanship where like Israel's assassinating people in Iran and Iran's vowing retaliation, and you have that. Then you have like Ukraine maybe attacking nuclear power plants in Kursk, and you have the stuff going on with China and the Houthis, and all this just insane stuff is going on. And like who's making decisions? Who's at the helm? If like who's going to call Netanyahu and tell him to stop? Who's going to talk to Putin and try to de-escalate? Like there's no one at the helm, and that's really scary. And I've heard that in a lot of countries, people are like, I think I heard in China, I don't know if this is true or not, that they're hoping that Trump wins just so there's someone they can talk to, because they're just tired of like Blinken coming over and saying one thing and then Biden saying something, and just people. There's kind of a thing in Death of Stalin where they basically say you can't trust a weak man, and Biden is an incredibly weak man. He can't make decisions. He doesn't have energy. He has to go to bed by like 4 p.m. And that honestly just really scares me more than anything else. The fact that you have this global superpower that no one is like at the helm with. There's no obvious leadership. There's no one really who seems to have decision-making powers.
Well, and this has historically been a problem with the U.S. empire, right? That I mean, you see this. I mean, look at how many times we've screwed over the Kurds, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be fair to say, well, why are we dealing with the Kurds to begin with? Right. We'll save that question for later. But it's very difficult to manage, a world-spanning empire when every 4 years, the beast is controlled by someone who has completely different ends. And look, if that was a problem 50 years ago, right, when we were still living in the post-war consensus, where most Americans had a broadly similar view of, what was right and wrong, or at least more so than we do now. Well, what do you do when you have effectively two different nations in the same polity, right? Two different groups of people who have obviously, very different views of, what should be done. And don't get me wrong, politics is a basic fact of human nature,
Mm-hmm.
but all the same, I mean, like simply look at the gulf between the two parties. Everyone admits that this is grown.
I don't like that's an issue. That's not even what I'm getting at though. I'm just saying that no one's in charge. Like Obama, like I didn't like Obama, but he would be like conscious enough to pick up the phone and understand like if Putin calls him, like he can at least pick up the phone and talk to him. Like Biden can't even do that. And Blinken is probably the worst Secretary of State in American history. I can't think of anyone worse. Like even if this was during, I don't know, I trust Colin Powell to pick up the phone. I trust Kissinger to pick up the phone. Like we're supposed to be relieved that like instead of Biden, they talk to Kamala or Blinken. They're both awful. Like,
I mean, this goes back to what we were saying earlier about crime and punishment. It's never comforting when you're voting for the most basic level of confidence, which is can pick up a phone and have a roughly cogent conversation.
I mean, once again, I'm being kind of facetious, but not even really. Like that is, I'm just trying to be blunt. That is kind of the point that the U.S. has reached, and the fact that like a significant portion of the country is okay with that is really scary. Really scary.
And again, this is another problem with Kamala, and I don't think Kamala Harris will be president for a number of reasons. One of which is I think that there's a powerful group of people that actually want Donald Trump to be president. Just look at the fact that the CEO of Chase Bank, the CEO of Blackstone, those people are putting their weight behind Trump. Sheldon Adelson's widow has given Trump a truly obscene amount of money. But I mean, there's a very basic problem with Kamala Harris, which is she has negative charisma, right? Nobody likes her. And okay, yeah, sure, that makes her a bad candidate, as someone who runs for office.
Mhm.
Uh, but do you think that the leaders of the world will look on her better than Democratic voters did, right? Where she won absolutely no delegates. I think the best she ever did was 3% of the Democratic primary.
Well, for all of Trump's talk, she got along with Trump way better than Biden. He at least like understood where Trump was coming from, and they could kind of do business together. The way I kind of view Trump as being the classic uh, walk softly but carry a big stick. Where I feel like what he tends to do is he'll be bellicose, he'll make a big deal of things, but then he'll offer the other side like a chance to resolve the situation where they save face or something like that. And he maybe goes a little overboard with just kind of like I said the rhetoric, but ultimately he's willing to kind of do diplomacy. Whereas the other thing I heard about Kamala from people who worked for her is she's extremely lazy. Like she never reads briefing materials. She doesn't go to meetings. She has an extremely light schedule. And like the same person said, like Biden, at least before his brain turned to mush, would at least read the briefing materials and try to be like understand the stuff. But from my understanding, Kamala is just very ineffective in general.
Well, and you've also heard reports, and these are always hard to believe because uh, anytime you hear the phrase anonymous sources, you can largely replace that with the phrase "I made it up." However, oftentimes in these political races, if you hear leaks from staffers, those are often, deliberate stories kind of put out to damage someone. Like you may remember, was it back in 2020 or was it 2016? Amy Klobuchar, right, a failed DNC nominee, got out of the race for, basically just emotionally tormenting her staff, like saying the most like literally
Oh yeah, I've
insane
heard. Oh
things.
yeah, getting to yeah, because I've heard Kamala has like a 90% turnover rate
Well,
or
right,
something ridiculous.
and that's how I was going to connect it. Right, is that her staff hates her, and okay, that's one thing, but the fact that that story is allowed to get out, that you and I are talking about that the newspaper is reporting on it, uh, indicates that she doesn't have the same kind of blanket air cover that Biden did in 2020.
Well, Biden, as I've said, is at least likable. Like he's like your senile drunk uncle who comes to the barbecue and starts telling stories you're pretty sure never happened, but you sit
Now,
down, you
I
have a
will
burger
say,
with the guy.
as he got more senile, I liked him more. Like the wild Biden stories, like that are just like they're not even politician level lies. Where to be like, oh, I improved inflation. I did this, I did that, I fixed potholes. His lies are like exactly you're right. It's like your crazy uncle at the barbecue. It's like my grandpa was eaten by cannibals, and they always called me Joe Bidenopoulos. Both of which are real stories about him, or at least
Yeah.
he purported them. So the point is, I know what you mean. He has a certain charisma to him.
Well, he's at least personally likable. Like Bill Clinton, you can say what you want about him, but he's likable. I think George W. Bush is likable. Hillary is not likable in any way, shape, or form. I think she's a very intelligent woman, but there's a guy who, an ex Secret Service agent, who wrote a memoir, and he said that she was the worst person he ever worked with by far. Um, was Hillary Clinton,
I
but
mean, that is far from the only source on that. She was extraordinarily unpopular.
but Kamala does who likes like the memes for Kamala are the most forced astroturf thing I think I've ever seen. Like they're even I didn't think something could make Dark Brandon look organic, but the coconut tree, the brat, the what's some of the other stuff we have? They're just like the worst memes
Uh,
I've ever seen.
we've called the other side weird, just completely destroying them with facts and logic.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't even really like okay, so just just because sometimes my brain tries to insert logic. So they just said that J.D. Vance and Trump were weird, and that was supposed to be like an own.
Yeah,
Like
that's literally it.
that's their okay. So that's their win. Okay.
So I will say one of the additional problems, and I actually saw an interesting infographic that was basically, marking based off current polling how, comparing the current polling on 2024
Yeah.
to how, Biden compared to Trump. And one of the most interesting ones is it seems like younger voters have shifted hard for Trump.
Yeah,
Like,
I've
don't get
seen
me
that.
wrong, Harris is still winning, but it's gone from being, I think it was plus 20 for Biden to plus 2, which is a massive collapse. Don't
Yeah,
quote me on those numbers,
no,
but
no,
point is,
I've seen that. I like to say whenever they're like, "Well, Trump's only winning 20% of the black vote." I'm like, "That's not the flex you think it is."
right. And then also remember, look at the branding on on her campaign. She's almost exclusively marketing herself to sort of like teen girls and terminally online leftists. All of these kind of memes that they don't make sense to you or I. Look at the tone behind all of them. It's just pure social signaling. Trump is bad and gross. We're cool. Vote for us. Which, don't get me wrong, that's what a lot of politics is. But they're tailoring that message to a very, very specific population who, let's be honest, was already going to vote for Kamala Harris anyway. Like, to me, I just don't see this as a very serious political campaign. And to me, it reminds me very much of, what the conservatives in the UK did in the last election, where it's like, okay, they ran candidates, but it didn't seem like a very serious effort from them. They sort of seemed to recognize
The
what was going on.
So the theory I've heard, this is what the Duran said, Alexander Mercouris said, was that they were afraid because the political situation was so bad that Reform UK or the British Workers' Party or some other alternative parties were going to start emerging. So they told Rishi Sunak to take one for the team and just go down and complete flames so Labour could get a supermajority and the current political system could be preserved. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's kind of an interesting theory. But yeah, like I agree with you. Like if you're, I just try to think anyone who's not like a teenage or gender fluid girl from like the coast. I don't really know what like Kamala offers you. Like Joe Biden had the whole fake blue collar thing going. And like I said, you can relate to him. He seems like your drunken uncle or something. But Kamala is like the woman, like the HR lady at your company who just is a complete bitch to you. Like I don't even I don't know who she appeals to.
Well, I mean, I think the secret is she appeals to absolutely nobody. I mean, again, I keep calling back to, the 2020 primary, which by the way, yeah, I think that, one of the things I like to do is kind of pull out these news stories from yesteryear that no one remembers. But, I'm sure you remember, how Biden went from being a distant fourth place as a nominee, right? All of a sudden, you know, all of his all of the people above him, winning more votes, mysteriously all drop out on the same day, right? Just happened to be that way. But if
Serves
you
this. Oh, sorry, go on.
but if you remember, Kamala Harris was never a leading candidate. I mean, she got demolished by Tulsi Gabbard, who, by the way, I think is sort of trying to rebrand herself as a Republican. I do not trust that woman at all. But she did. I mean, she just stone cold stunnered, just absolutely demolished Kamala Harris. And I mean, she was not able to recover from it. She was never particularly popular. And then, one attack and she was just finished. And I mean, look, like going back to last night's interview with Trump and Elon Musk, look, I think that, to be honest, Trump played his cards well in the debate with Biden, where he just kind of let him, be senile. He gave him enough rope to hang himself. But I mean, let's be honest, Trump has extreme charisma and is very good at thinking on his feet. And we
Mhm.
put him across from a woman who is, shall we say, lacking. I don't see that going well.
Just a slight aside, Serp called the 2020 Democratic primary Four Skeletons in the Antichrist.
I'll check that out.
Um, Antichrist being Pete Buttigieg. And then you had like Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and I forget who the other guy. There was some other really old guy who was running, but it's like what else is bizarre is just how bad the Democratic bench is. Like that she was the best that they could do. I think so one of the issues is they couldn't go with like Gavin Newsom or someone who's somewhat better because then they'd be telling the black woman to go sit at the back of the political bus for like some white guy to run over her. Um, but and also like if I was any of those people, I would refuse. I wouldn't want to do this election when it's such a mess.
Well, and I think that there's actually a very smart play being made here, which is I think that, and I've said this, a multitude of times, but I think that Biden is going to prove to be a very useful sort of scapegoat in the sense that if he is not already, he will soon be dead. And so political fallout from things like extreme mass immigration, costly wars abroad, can be pinned on
Inflation.
Biden. Yeah, inflation can be Biden. It can be like, oh, that dead white guy we don't like. And I think that, and this is not just, me, freaking out, but it does seem like we're in store for a significant economic downturn, if not this year, then soon.
Oh yeah, just the
And
money printing and yeah.
well, and I think that that's a very smart bet if you decide, you know what, we'll let Donald take that on the chin. And then in 4 years, we can come back and sort of clean up and reap the benefits of all of those new Americans Biden let in the door, now that they've had kids or they've gotten amnesty, they're new voters. And I wonder if there's at least someone sort of, making that play.
Yeah, the whole thing was bizarre because so from my understanding, and the whole thing is really opaque, but the Clintons were pro Biden and Obama was pro Kamala. Because I think the Clintons endorsed Biden like the day of him stepping down. I mean, it's pretty clear that there was some sort of a palace coup
Well,
that
and that actually goes back to your point about no one being in charge,
yeah.
right? Where, if everyone knew Biden was going to step down, no one would have embarrassed themselves by endorsing a man who was about to declare himself mentally unfit. A number of celebrities did this. So I do think that, and you've heard reports, of course, unverified, that, Biden was sort of living as like an imperial emperor, right? Kind of closeted away
Yeah.
from, even his own staffers.
Mhm.
But I do think that debate that I alluded to earlier, where it was very, very clear that Biden was out to lunch, I think that freaked out people. I mean, you saw that the donors basically saying like, well, if Biden runs, we'll pull out our money. And so I think that, that was obviously a surprise to people. I mean, even to the level of the Clintons, who are, very, very connected.
Yeah, I mean, once again, if the president can just get cooed like that, that's also just not it's just not a very stable situation. It's just not really where you want to go. But the thing is, and it's so unnecessary. Like as I've said, if Biden had have just said last year around this time, look, I'm getting old. I don't think I have it in me to do another term. I accomplished whatever it is. I said I saved democracy from Trump. I'm not going to run for reelection. I think there would have been zero problems. I think no one would have questioned it. They would have had a proper primary, and things might have like worked out. It's so weird. But just to bring up a point I previously mentioned, can you think of a quicker turn in the media narrative in your lifetime than Biden is sharp as a tack? The Biden has to go, like pre-post debate.
No, really, I can't. And I mean, especially on the kind of sliding scale of, right-wing conspiracy to generally accepted fact, right? The idea of Biden being senile. I mean, we were talking about it earlier when, the was it the New York Post was kicked off of Twitter for talking about, the
The
Hunter Biden
yeah.
laptop. I mean, that was, I think, the first crack, right? Where, pardon the pun, right? The first kind of chink in the armor, where it became clear that, okay, like you can talk about that. That's sort of become, part of the allowable discourse. And then, you know, you're right. It was a very quick turn. And I mean, to me, going back to this question of who is in charge, I mean, it reminds me very much of, what Moldbug talks about, of this sort of kind of like decentralized system. Because, I mean, I think the thesis that the president is in charge of the country has been disproven in two different ways by two presidents, right? By Trump, where he would say, build a wall. It doesn't happen. Or he'd say, no war in Syria. A war in Syria happens. So, okay, we have a strong executive. That won't work. Well, what about Biden? Well, the country continues running, maybe not well, but the lights still turn on. And it's very, very clear that he's not issuing any orders at all. And so, I think that really it's sort of kind of shown the degree to which the system runs itself.
Mm-hmm. It's no, but it's just, and I compared it to the scene in 1984 where they're having like the anti-Eurasia rally, and then halfway through the like speech, they just start yelling about how the real enemy is East Asia. We've always been at war with East Asia, and everyone just immediately like goldfish forgets what's happening. Like at a level, the whole thing just kind of disturbs me. Once again, it's hard to know what the public actually thinks versus the media, but the fact that just everybody could, like within an hour, go from you're mentally unstable if you think Biden is senile to Biden has to go 100%, there's no way he can run, and not find that weird is just disturbing to me on like a basic level.
Well, I'll put it this way. I love democracy, and I'm so glad that we have put the direction of our country in the hands of people who, you know, can't remember a political narrative from 8 days ago.
Well, I mean,
But
but Trump's too old to be president. You can't have a man that old being president.
that's true. And honestly, look, like, uh, in all seriousness, there's a level to which I sort of welcome the ridiculousness,
Mm-hmm.
both because obviously, these people are my enemies, and it's like I'd rather have, ridiculous enemies than competent ones. But also, it's sort of a case in which, you laugh to keep yourself from crying, right? It's like, I like where I live, I like my country, and it is run by, you know, HR women, DMV workers, and a very, very senile, racist Irish man.
Uh, yeah, but at the same time, like I said, it is comforting to a certain extent. But like I said, we're facing so many global crises, and none of these people can make a decision. So, is something going to happen? Is there going to be World War III? Probably not. But it's still I find it concerning, and I will sleep better once at least somebody is in charge of the U.S. Even if it's Kamala, at least there will be a president.
Well, fair enough, Argent, and we've hit our time limit. So if people want to find you and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just at my YouTube channel, just called Argent, spelt the same as my name, and yeah, discover all kinds of different stuff there. Or you can follow me on Twitter.
And I will say, I highly recommend your work, Argent, because I've never had a guest on before where I've got a more polarizing reaction. Not in the sense that people, like you and hate you. That was all positive. But half the people are saying, oh, thank God, someone's finally talking to Argent. And the other half was saying, who is this guy? He sounds interesting. So it seems like you're kind of siloed. And so I really want to encourage people
Oh,
to
okay.
check out
Thank you.
your
That's
work.
very kind of you. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I am an avid watcher of your stuff, both because you offer a geopolitical insight that I do not have, And then also because you inform me of very important happenings, like the fact that Rich from Review Tech is absolutely melting down, and I never would have found that out, and I'm glad that I know now. So highly,
No, I try to cover a lot of stuff. Variety is the spice of life.
Well, fair enough. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. I highly appreciate your reviews. I read them and laugh on company time. You can also check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Just a heads up, we're finally settling the last few details on the new branding. You guys who listen on audio will have heard the new audio intro outro buffers. We've got a new video version of those that will be coming up soon. I wanted to make it better, so it's taking longer than the old one took to make. Also, having a job is sort of deleterious to spending hours on audio editing projects. And then lastly, there'll be some new visual assets, but the content stays the same. I appreciate you guys for bearing with me. And remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.